In this video, I'll be talking about the three major planes of the body, how the major axes correspond to each one, and a simple rule to help imagine them. Now let's first take a short quiz to see if we know what the anatomical planes are. Pause the video and see if you can identify which plane the pictures were taken from. A is from the transverse plane, B is from the frontal plane, C is from the sagittal plane. If you got anything wrong or need further clarification, check out this video that I made about the anatomical planes. Now let's start off with me being in anatomical position in the frontal plane. When we're talking about the major axes, let's go back to when we first learned about graphing and the coordinate system. The horizontal line is the x-axis, the vertical line is the y-axis. Now because the human body isn't a two-dimensional thing, we need to account for the third dimension. Here's me being in anatomical position at about 45 degrees from the front. Again, I'll first draw the x-axis and the y-axis. To account for the third dimension, I'll be drawing another line coming straight out called the z-axis. If this is hard to visualize and remember, here's a simple tip which I'll refer to as the right hand rule. Take your right hand and have your palm facing you. Make an L with your thumb and your index finger. Your thumb is your x-axis and your index finger is your y-axis. Now have the rest of your fingers face straight at you, and this is your z-axis. This also corresponds to what direction is positive for each axis in case you do not remember. Now in anatomy, these axes can also be referred to as different names, and since they can sound similar to the anatomical planes, it'd be good to differentiate them. If you take the x-axis and move it up and down to create a plane from it, what does it look like? The frontal or coronal plane. Therefore, the x-axis can also be referred to as the coronal axis. If you look at the y-axis, since it is straight up and down, it can also be referred to as the vertical axis. If you look at the z-axis, it goes straight front and back. In anatomical terms, what is front and back? Anterior and posterior. Therefore, the z-axis can also be referred to as the anterior or posterior axis, or AP axis. Now let's combine the axes and the anatomical planes. Something to always remember is that the axis that corresponds to an anatomical plane is always perpendicular to that plane. So let's take the sagittal plane. If you draw a line perpendicular to this plane, it will look just like the x-axis or coronal axis. Therefore, rotation in the sagittal plane occurs around the x-axis or coronal axis. Now if we took the transverse plane and drew a line perpendicular to this plane, it would look like the y-axis or vertical axis. Therefore, rotation in the transverse plane happens around the y-axis or vertical axis. Finally, if we took the frontal plane and drew a perpendicular line to this plane, how does it look? It would look like the z-axis or the AP axis. Therefore, rotation in the frontal plane happens around the z-axis or AP axis. Now sometimes I forget off the top of my head which axis and plane corresponds with which, so I go back to my trusty right hand rule with the XYZ axis. Now imagine a piece of paper that intersects the x-axis. Now what is this plane? Well, I know that it is a sagittal plane, so the sagittal plane rotates around the x-axis. How about the plane that intersects the y-axis? What is this plane? Well, I know that this is a transverse plane, so the transverse plane rotates around the y or vertical axis. And lastly, we have the frontal plane. And which axis does this rotate around? The z-axis, or anterior-posterior axis. Now here's a short quiz to see if you understand the material. Pause the video and see if you can identify which plane the movement is happening in, as well as the corresponding axis. The answer to A is transverse plane around the y-axis vertical axis. The answer to B is the sagittal plane around the x-axis or coronal axis. And the answer to number 3 is the frontal plane around the z-axis or AP axis.